What's up, AP Psych? Welcome back. This is video number 3 of our biological psychology unit. In this video, we're going to start going over some of the major brain structures and their functions, and also ways psychologists and doctors study the brain. So I would think that a lot of these are going to be new to you, new brain structures, new terms, unless you're currently taking anatomy or have taken anatomy in the past. So take your time with these, pause, review, go back, ask me questions if you have any. So to get started, before we dive into the brain structures, we're going to talk about how scientists and psychologists study the brain. First up is a technique called brain lesioning. Now, this isn't necessarily always a technique. A brain lesion is any damage to a part of the brain that impairs functioning, right? That's brain injuries, accidents, things like that happen. And you can kind of see the removed or dead tissue in this image here. And this gives a lot of information for psychologists and scientists towards what parts of the brain control what different activities and different functions. There's also a case where a doctor may experimentally destroy brain tissue to study animal behaviors, to see what they're like after the destruction and what those brain areas may control. And if they're going to do this in humans, it's almost only ever done for medicinal purposes or for potentially scientific purposes. Usually, we study brain lesions because of some type of damage or accident that impairs functioning. We can learn a lot from that brain lesion. Next up, we have something called an EEG, or an electroencephalogram. This is an amplified recording of the electrical waves sweeping across the brain's surface, and it's measured by these little electrodes placed on the scalp. And they measure, like it said, our brain waves. So you can see the different levels of brain function at different times of the day, during different activities, things you're asked to do. You can see your brain waves change. You can kind of see here when we get to altered states of consciousness and we talk about sleep and dreaming and things like that, your brain waves change as you move through the different stages of sleep, or as you're focused on a task or an activity and you're engaged in something. And this is a great way to check brain function and determine that everything is behaving normally. Next up, we have what's called an MRI scan, and this is magnetic resonance imaging. This uses magnetic fields and radio waves to produce these computer-generated images that distinguish different types of brain tissue. So this kind of looks like an X-ray maybe, right? But X-rays only show bone and hard matter. An MRI scan can be put together to show the soft tissue in our brains, and it creates a 3D picture of those internal structures. Like you can see here in these images, a 3D picture of the brain. It's more effective than other scans at detecting abnormalities in small structures of your brain because it gives a full image of your brain. For example, in these two images here, on the upper right, this shows a ventricular enlargement in a schizophrenic patient, right? So we can actually see the difference in brain structure between someone who has schizophrenia and someone who doesn't. And this is really useful when doctors and scientists are looking at brain structures to determine if they are normal or abnormal, and they can help treat people that way with MRIs. In addition to an MRI, you have something called a functional magnetic resonance imaging, or an fMRI. This is the same thing as an MRI scan, except the doctor is going to be asking you to complete tasks while you're in the MRI chamber, right? And it's called functional because it shows your brain structures, just like an MRI, but it also lights up with color to show the blood flow in specific aspects and areas of the brain, which indicates the amount of neural activity in each part of the brain. So not only are you going in to see your brain structures, but they're going to ask you questions and have you do things, and you're going to respond. And by doing that, different areas of your brain will light up, and that'll show, are things functioning correctly? Is there a limit of function in this area of the brain? And things like that. So it's not just the structure that an MRI provides, but it's also the function and seeing the blood flow and the activity in your brain increase or decrease as you're asked to do tasks. Similar to that, there's something called a PET scan or a positron emission tomography. That's a technique that's used to observe the different metabolic processes in the brain and the body. So in this case, you're going to be injected or ingest a radioactive form of glucose. And then the PET scan takes photos as it moves through the body and brain. And you can see different places that it goes to in your body and brain and make sure that your brain is functioning correctly and the different parts of your body are functioning correctly as well. You can see here, it lights up in your brain as the glucose goes to the places that are being used. In a normal brain versus mild cognitive impairment and someone who has Alzheimer's disease. So these PET scans really tell us how much of the brain is functioning and where the function is occurring. Also, in terms of the body, where the glucose goes, you can see this person, they identified cancerous tumors because of where the glucose gathered in and shows. So as we move on, that's the ways we study the brain. Next on your notes, you have a diagram of the structures of the brain. So I want you to take some time now to fill that out and match up the structures that you have on this first part of notes. Not all of these on your screen here are going to be included in that, but we will talk about each one. And I want you to take some time now, maybe pause the video and fill out that diagram, which will help you greatly going into our Talk of the Brain this week. One more diagram, which is also in your notes. Couldn't show this on the last one because this is part of the limbic system, the hypothalamus, the amygdala, the hippocampus, and they're a little bit deeper into your brain, covered by some of the other structures. So we needed another diagram to show exactly where they are. You couldn't necessarily see them all here because of the other structures that we have. So we provided it here as well. So take a second, pause the video, fill those in on your notes as well. As we move into our talk of brain structures, we're going to start with the older brain structures, or the old brain. This is the oldest part of the brain, beginning where the spinal cord swells and enters the skull. And this is responsible for our automatic survival functions, right? It was the oldest part of the brain. It developed earliest, so it's our most primitive and controls our most important functions, such as our heartbeat, breathing, body temperature regulation, things like that, that humans needed to evolve with to survive. Our first examples of the brain stem. Number one is something called the medulla. This is at the base of the brain stem. And like we just said, it controls our vital functionings like heartbeat and breathing, right? That's the medulla's job. Our autonomic functions, the autonomic nervous system, right? It controls those things. Next up, you have something called the reticular formation, or also you might hear it as the reticular activating system. This is that little bundle of nerve fibers, a nerve network in the brainstem that plays an important role in controlling arousal. It's involved in attention and sleep through filtering out stimuli. So you might notice this little bundle of fibers continues and projects up into the brain. That's how it deals with arousal, right? As the brain needs to be woken up and different areas need to be activated, the reticular activating system is responsible for that in arousing the different parts of the brain that need to be involved in certain tasks. It also works with something called the pons, which we'll get to in a second, that helps you fall asleep and stay asleep while you're sleeping. This activating system filters out different stimuli, different sounds that are unnecessary, and helps keep you asleep, and may arouse or awake you if something important occurs and it needs your attention. As we continue, we mentioned the thalamus, which is at the top of the brainstem. It's the brain's sensory switchboard, which directs messages to the sensory areas in the cortex and transmits replies to the cerebellum and the medulla. So any sensory information that comes in through our senses to our brain is then going to be directed to the proper place by your thalamus. It is the sensory switchboard. In the way that the pituitary gland is the master gland, the thalamus is like the sensory switchboard and the master of our senses and activating the right brain structures that need to be in those cases. Our other brainstem brain structure is the pons. This is the bridge between the brain and the spinal cord, especially dealing with motor messages and our sleeping or sleep cycle. Okay, this helps us fall asleep and regulate our sleep and also our motor functions. Finally, the cerebellum is something which means the little brain, and it's attached to the rear of the brainstem right here. It's known as our little brain because it helps kind of coordinate all of our voluntary movements and balance and posture. So all of those little things, if you were to have some type of brain damage to the cerebellum, you could have severe impairment with your voluntary muscle movements as well as your balance and posture, which would not be a great experience. Next up, we're coming to a system called the limbic system. And this was that system I touched on, and we had a different diagram for it because it's a little bit more towards the midbrain, right? We just talked about the hind brain or the lower brain structures, the older brain structures. Now we're getting into the midbrain area and some of the things involved with that. It's a donut-shaped system of neural structures at the border of the brainstem and the cerebrum, which is this upper area of your brain. It's associated with emotions like fear, aggression, drives for food, sex. It includes the hippocampus, amygdala, and hypothalamus. We'll talk about each one individually. So it regulates a lot of our emotions. First up, you have the amygdala, which is this little blue bulb-looking structure here on the tip of the hippocampus. It's two almond-shaped neural clusters linked to emotion of fear and anger, right? We have one on each side, our left and right hemisphere. And like it says, it regulates our emotions of fear and anger. So when we talk about the fight or flight with our sympathetic nervous system, the amygdala is often involved in that, especially if we're talking fear and anger and we get scared, we're ready to flee, or we're in an anger situation where we need to fight something off. The amygdala is heavily involved in that. The hippocampus, this is this finger-like structure that kind of bends around here in the light blue. It's attached to the amygdala, and it's involved in processing new memories. So if you think about that, some of our strongest memories come from fear or anger, right? And that's because those two are attached. Something that's also very key to memory or associated with memory is our sense of smell. There's an olfactory bulb that's in this area here, not the pituitary gland right there, but it's in this similar area. And because of the close proximity of the olfactory bulb and our hippocampus, we have very, very strong memories associated with senses of smell. You can think about an example right now, I'm sure. I think of, my grandma's cookies, or walking into an old house and you smell that and you immediately have that thought of all the things that you've seen there, done there. So sense of smell is a strong connection to memory because of its proximity to the hippocampus, which forms new memories. As we continue, our last structure of the limbic system is the hypothalamus, which is this kind of aqua color here. It is just below the thalamus, right, which is the sensory switchboard of the brain, right? The hypothalamus, it directs several maintenance activities: eating, drinking, body temperature, sex drive. It helps govern the endocrine system via the pituitary gland, right? And it helps release those hormones through the pituitary gland that we might need to regulate things like hunger, desire to eat, sex, thirst, right? So it's a very, very important structure in regulating our body and keeping it at what we call homeostasis, right? The proper temperature, satisfied in eating, drinking, things like that. There are two parts to the hypothalamus. You have something called the ventromedial hypothalamus, and these both kind of deal with our drive to eat. But the ventromedial tells you when to stop eating. Okay? It says stomach's full, you don't need any more. A great way to remember this: ventromedial starts with a V, kind of sounds like vomit. You'll vomit if you eat too much, right? So it tells you to stop. That's your ventromedial hypothalamus. On the other side, you have the lateral hypothalamus. This tells you when you're hungry. It sends messages like, hey, we're getting hungry, don't want to starve, let's eat something so we can survive. Lateral Guess it starts with an L, so does let's eat. That's a good way to remember the lateral hypothalamus. But the hypothalamus directs the body's drives, right? The drives that we need to survive, eating, drinking, body temperature, sex, those type of things, all controlled by the hypothalamus with the help of the pituitary gland. And that's the connection between our brain structures and our nervous system and our endocrine system and our hormones. Our last thing, this is something we're going to get into more in depth in our next video, but the cerebral cortex is the intricate fabric of interconnected neural cells that covers the cerebral hemispheres. It's a fancy way of saying just these top area of your brain here. This is the cerebral cortex. This is the body's ultimate control and information processing center. You can see it doesn't seem like these brain structures down here are older and much more differentiated. Up here, the cerebral cortex is just all those interconnected neural cells communicating, and they're responsible for higher order thought. And this is the brain structure that separates us from all other living organisms because we are able to produce higher order thinking skills. And that's our separator. One thing that connects the two sides of the cerebral cortex and divides the brain into hemispheres is something called the corpus callosum. It's a band of nerves, you can see it here on a brain that's been pulled apart, that connect the two cortical hemispheres and carries messages between them. So this allows the left brain and the right brain to communicate and share information and produce that higher order thought that we need to be the most intelligent species on Earth, right? And that's why our brain is structured the way it is. We'll get more into that in our next video when we talk about the hemispheres and the lobes of the brain and their responsibilities. So this was a lot of information about new brain structures, the older brain structures, the autonomic brain structures that regulate our drives and our internal needs. If you have any questions, please let me know. As usual, I hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you in class.